Evening and welcome back to our Foundation Year program offered by the Center for Applied Theology and the local urban abbeys. This is our 11th session, and tonight we turn from the Neoplatonic question to that of Boethius. We will hear something about who he is and his most famous work, The Consolation of Philosophy. And to lead us in that discussion is Dr. Stephen Blackwood, resident in Savannah, Georgia. And I will ask Father David Harris to tell us a little bit about Stephen.
Well, that sounds like an open invitation. Stephen and I actually grew up together. He was 2 years younger than me, I think, 2 or 3 years younger, so I never paid any attention to him at all. He was the oldest of 37 children.
Just about
37, and he and I both fell under the spell of a genius named Robert Krauss, and both of us, I think, were inspired to a vocation. My vocation led me to the priesthood, and Dr. Blackwood's vocation led him into the academy. Both of us, I think, are conjoined twins in our passion for what we're talking about tonight. And just last night, I listened to Dr. Blackwood on this very theme. And at certain points, I was almost shivering with enthusiasm for his insight into this text. So Dr. Blackwood, we're so grateful that you're going to be with us tonight. And I'm going to hand it over to Father James for the first question.
Thank you for that. I suppose something similar could be said of most of the figures we've discussed on the program so far, but I personally find the story of Boethius particularly significant, fascinating, but I also think that it feeds into the work that he produces in a way that maybe I couldn't say regarding some of the other texts and their authors. Could you tell us a little bit about, very simply, who Boethius was and why I've led you into the question the way I have?
I'd be delighted to say a few things about that. And let me first say what a pleasure it is to be here with you all. These are remarkable times, to say the least. And I'm really just think it's wonderful, this whole initiative to give a way for us to gather and think together in a way that it's a kind of technological instantiation of the communion of the saints. I don't think that's how Zoom describes itself, but I I'm very glad to be here, and I hope that you will feel free to jump in, interrupt, query, disagree, or follow up with other questions as you all wish. I think this will be most illuminating the more we're all sort of in it, in a way. And it is true that it is not actually true that Father Harris paid no attention to me, because I think he sold me at a very competitive discount his skateboard, which it's safe to say caused me a good series of injuries in my failure to master that particular craft. But in any event, on to Boethius. Who was this man with this foreign-sounding name? I hope you'll not mind if I sort of play fast and loose with broad, sweeping historical and other themes in order to give you a bit of who Boethius is and why I think he's important, not simply objectively in any fair account of the cultural history, of civilizational history, of Western history, of Christian history, European history, keeping in mind that Boethius was translated first into English by King Alfred during the Carolingian period. and we'll come to that maybe in a minute, but also why I think Boethius has something perennial to say, and maybe even specially to say to us now. I know you've spent some time going through the Greeks and some of the, let's say, pivotal texts in this wonderful sort of journey you're on this year. And I just want to refer back to a couple of moments in the ancients, more ancient ancients than Boethius, just by way of maybe drawing those together and having them in view for us. There's a way, I think, in which you can understand the whole of the ancient Greek standpoint as discovering and thinking through the relation between the divine and human, or between the realm of the gods and our realm here on earth. And the Greek answer ultimately is that there's a knowable relation between these. It's not simply totally incommensurate that off there are the gods and we have no relation to them other than to be subject to their whims. There's a sense that the human and divine, that the material and the spiritual, that the temporal and eternal, that the finite and the infinite, and any other way you might frame these two sides of things, there's a sense in which they come together, and that the life of the gods is in somehow, which we might say is, let's call it the nature of reality itself, is somehow present to us and in us and knowable by us. There's some wonderful images of this in, of course, all of Greek literature in a way is a meditation on this theme, the beauties and powers of this theme, but also the limits of this, of our comprehension. But one of them that I always come back to, given to me by one of my teachers, someone that Father Harris and I both know, is a line from the Odyssey when Odysseus finds himself shipwrecked, or not even shipwrecked. At this point, he's just washed up on the shore of Ithaca. Sorry, in this case, I'm thinking of Phaeacia when he washes up. Here, it's as though he's shipwrecked, but he's been delivered by the Phaeacians. And Athena approaches him in disguise, and there's this wonderful moment when Odysseus says, Odysseus, being a very Athenian Odysseus, puts on a disguise to try and dissimulate and to hide who he is from Athena. And Athena says to him something like, two of a kind are we, connivers both. And there's this wonderful sense of the communion between the likeness between Odysseus, the wily, intelligent Odysseus, and Athena, the goddess or power of knowing, of wisdom, and kind of friendship, let's even say. And you can approach this in all kinds of ways, but the next moment I want to draw out is, I know you've spent some time with Plato in the last months, and the whole doctrine, as we now call it, the teaching of recollection, of Platonic recollection, is fundamentally to say that that as we move inward into ourselves, we discover the forms, the patterns, the ideas that are indeed the nature of reality itself. And so that as we move inward, in a way, we also move upward, that our own, if you'll allow this language to move into the, say, to put it in an Augustinian form, that our own self, I know this is not strictly Augustinian language, or our own subjectivity, our own personality, our own knowing, our own being, knowing, and willing, as Augustine will put it, the own activity of ourselves is itself not just a kind of image in an imitative way of God's life, a very weak image of the life of the principle of the procession, the moving out and back of the whole of the principle itself of the Trinity, we understand in Christian terms, not simply a kind of image, but also an instance of that. It is God in us. And in a way, what the Greeks begin to understand, and Dr. Diamond, Eli, is so good on these questions, is that is the whole nature of everything. That nature of God's own moving out and back in knowledge, which it's nature of everything, but in particular the nature of ourselves. And so recollection for Plato is that movement inward in which we discover in us that which is beyond us and which constitutes us. So I want to just by way of getting to Boethius, say two other things. And the first is that, when one thinks about the ancient Greeks, I mean, you're really looking at this just astounding, that the golden age of Athens, at this astounding period in the history of human culture in which, in 100 years comes to be these just breathtaking wonders. And all of it in a way is related to what I've been saying a minute ago about the relation between the eternal things and our lives. You see this in architecture, you see it in drama, you see it in sculpture, you see it in of course in philosophy and the literature. But this thinking through the relation that human life has to the eternal realities. And there's a sense in which if the Greeks had lost, as any fair-minded observer would have, I think, any statistically based analysis would have led one to conclude, lost the battle at Salamis or Thermopylae or any of these other key moments, it seems to me entirely within the realm of reason to think that would have been it. Like, this amazing thing that later gave rise to Western culture, very broadly speaking, could have come to an end. It would have been just a blip on the historic radar of a little bit of kind of, Mediterranean culture for a few centuries. And yet, under Alexander, and then, of course, above all through the Roman Empire and above all through the administration of Caesar, if you will allow me the metaphor, the seeds of the ancient Greeks, these wonderful ideas and ideals, it's as though those are seeds which Alexander and then Caesar and others, I mean, I know this is a long, millennium of development. I don't pretend to be a historian, but just to hold with me in this, it's as though these seeds are taken and spread all throughout what later becomes, and indeed even beyond what later becomes Europe. But if we focus on the period of this in Rome, you have this amazing things where the Greek seeds are spread through the Romans all throughout this vast Roman empire, which, as you know, stretches from Asia Minor and Africa, all throughout the Mediterranean, into northerly parts that even you are now sitting in today. And the point I want to make is this: is that along this amazing story of Rome, along it goes. And one of the things that is animating it, is that giving it life, are indeed these seeds of the Greeks. Roman culture is very fundamentally influenced by Greek intellectual life. And so much so that the Roman aristocracy for hundreds of years can speak and read Greek fluently. And so, they have direct access, many of them, to the ideas of the Greeks. And the reason this matters for Boethius is because towards the very end, of course, he didn't know it was the end, at the very end of the Roman Empire, the language of Greek is being lost. And what that means is that the intellectual foundations of the Greeks and of Rome, in a certain sense, are being lost, in a very deep sense, being lost. And along in 475 or so is born this fellow named Boethius. And I'll just very quickly say that he's born into a patrician family, into a wealthy family, though both his father and grandfather die while he's fairly young, and he's then adopted by another patrician family. And his adopted father, Symmachus, is one of the increasingly rare members of the Roman aristocracy that still has Greek, and gives Boethius this amazing education. It's thought he may have been educated at Athens, or maybe elsewhere. Maybe he never went to Greece. Maybe he learned his Greek in Rome. But in any event, he comes to this, becomes this amazingly well-educated fellow. And as he grows older, and you should just have a sense of the time period here. In 475, Boethius is born. In 476 is officially the fall of the Roman Empire, and it's not as though life just stops. It's kind of as though Britain were taken over by a foreign power, and a new king put on top of everything else, but everything else kind of stays the same. Parliament is there, and so on and so forth. The House of Lords, it's all sort of intact, but not totally intact. That's kind of what happens in the early days of the Roman Empire. And Boethius, I think, is just very keenly aware that Greek learning is necessary to what he comes to understand as the whole 1,000-year history of Rome. And so he sets as one of his goals to translate these works from ancient Rome, from Latin, from ancient Greece, from Greek, into Latin, to Romanize them. And you should know, I think, that he's a real polymath. He's a musician. He's a poet. He's a magnificent writer. He's philosophically astoundingly gifted. He apparently is gifted also in the sciences and in mathematics and astronomy. And so he sets as his goal to translate these core texts, let's say, from the Greeks into Latin. I should get my order right here. And I'll draw these introductory remarks to a close very shortly here. I just want to connect the dots by saying that, so he does this. Meanwhile, he's rising to a very high level of stature in the empire. He's a senator, and then made a consul. He's made the master of offices of the whole empire, which is sort of a ceremonial role. But he's a very powerful, influential, valued, wealthy, connected, learned man. And he's translating these works and actually gives rise, you should know, gives rise to this whole kind of notion of the quadrivium, of the liberal arts that would be so important in the Middle Ages. But then disaster strikes. Boethius is accused of treason by this barbarian. It's maybe not quite the fairest way to refer to Theodoric, but in any event, by the barbarian King Theodoric, and he's accused of treason, of colluding with the East, with the Eastern Empire. And we don't really actually know what happened. Maybe Boethius was involved in trying to unify the empire. He flatly denies, and I think we can trust him, that he was doing anything that he thought was treasonous. But in any event, he's accused of treason, and it appears there's a good deal of insider slander and effort to take him down through dishonest means. In any event, he's put under house arrest for a year, and at the end of that year of house arrest, and I just want you to keep in mind the great accomplishments and renown, the beautiful learning, and the deep wisdom of this man. At the end of that year, he's tortured brutally until he dies. It's thought that a rope was tied around his head and pulled by horses until his eyes and brains popped out. So that was the end of Boethius. All of his hopes of restoring the Roman Empire dashed. Within a few years, Rome really is over. The empire is at an end. And so that's the end of Boethius in a certain sense. But in a deeper sense, maybe I would offer to you, it's not the end. And I think this is where Boethius's witness is so powerful to us today. He, while he's in prison, he writes a book, and you can put this up with prison literature like the letter from the Birmingham jail and other moments of creativity, literary creativity in prison. He writes a book, and this book is very different than these other books he's written. He's written these translations I mentioned over time, and you can pick those up on the library or bookstore, and I think you'll find them not that easy to read. His work on the De Musica, a translation of the Greek Nicomachus, is, man, it is tough going. It's all about your ratios and mathematical. I mean, I have read it, but it's not the kind of thing that you're going to take to bed at night to inspire you about Western culture. And so too his work on his translation of Porphyry. The reason I mention that is because this book that he writes from prison has a totally different character. It's a dramatic dialogue. It's a conversation between a prisoner and a woman named Philosophy, who represents the whole of wisdom. And in this beautiful drama, this conversation back and forth, this woman approaches this prisoner who's totally lost a sense of himself, lost himself. And through her poetry, her song, her arguments, she reminds him. She reminds him of and recollects him to his deep, true self. So that's the book we're talking about today, and I'll say just in conclusion that the amazing thing in history, Christians might say in God's providence, is that this slender little volume, which some of you have before you, we don't even know how it made it out of the prison that he was in. We don't know anything really, or very little, about how it survived. We only know that after a couple of hundred years, and just think about that, after a couple of hundred years. I just want to offer that to you as you think about the efforts in your own life towards goodness and beauty and truth. What scope or scale or timeline you might want to think about them on. After a couple of hundred years, this book begins really to be in circulation, and it becomes, it's hard to, in an age of bestsellers, it's quite something to be on the bestseller for a few weeks. That's usually how that's counted, right? Weeks. Boethius is at the top of the bestseller list for really 1,000 years. He's one of the few books that anyone who could read in the West would certainly have read. It's one of the most widely copied works of literature for hundreds and hundreds of years. And, you know, it's, as I say, it's translated by Albert. It plays a role in the Carolingian Renaissance. His translations play a role in transmitting those seeds of Greek wisdom to the Latin, to the later Latin culture of the Middle Ages. He's, as I say, translated by Albert as one of the few works that Albert, Alfred, what am I saying, Albert? Jeez. Alfred, King Alfred, that few works that he thinks should be available in English to be read. So Boethius gives us in this beautiful volume both a way of thinking about how those ideas that open up the self can be preserved, but also, and I think this is really the secret, it's really the heart of it all, how the recollection and internal exploration and understanding of his own self, the bearing of himself, becomes the very means not only of his own salvation or recollection, but of that for so many others too. Perhaps that's more than enough by way of an introduction. I'm sorry to go on so long.
No, that was incredible, absolutely incredible. Let's jump. I don't want to interrupt your flow. Jump right into the Consolation. What's he doing? Why? I mean, it's such a short text. It's kind of crazy in a way. It's written by a Christian, but it's not explicitly Christian. So influential. Jump right into what this text is doing and saying.
Sure. Well, I'm just going to take a scattershot approach here and just say a few things. The first thing I think it needs to be said is that, you know, huge amounts of this book are not original. I mean, he's reciting and conveying arguments and ideas, and even imitating a style of Latin from much earlier ages. Of course, he's very fluent in Greek and Latin literature, but I think what he's doing here is creating a kind of handbook for that recollection. This is broadly speaking classed by some as consolation literature, and I think it's important to take that really at face value. I sometimes mention that a friend of mine who has since died of the cancer she had just been diagnosed with, and I were speaking, and I just didn't know what to say. We didn't know each other that well. We were working on a nonprofit board together, but we were in Boston, and I think I was next to the Harvard bookstore, the Coop as they call it, and I just went in and bought her a copy of Boethius. And just gave it to her. And she wrote to me a couple of weeks later saying that, and she was a writer too, she was a beautiful writer. Carrie Host was her name. And she wrote to me and she said, you know, it was as though words had never been as powerful to her as in reading the Consolation. And so I want to foreground our discussion or these brief reflections about what is in this book with the idea, and in some ways for me, the fact, the simple fact that this book works. It does what Boethius wants it to do, which is bring about that work of recollection. So, but the basic structure of the book, I mean, it's written in 5 books, little mini books, as you know, and those begin straight away. You know, he's in a state of total psychological. He's just a wreck. He's a total mess. Woe is me. He's crying. He's just a mess. And along comes this woman, and there's a lot we could say about this woman, and perhaps we'll talk about philosophy's stature as a sapiential figure, as even at one point she calls herself sapientia, and of course sapientia is the Latin word for wisdom. And we'll maybe touch on this when we talk about Boethius's Christianity in a minute. But this fearsome and powerful figure comes on the scene, and one of the things I just love about this is that I can barely talk about how beautiful this book is without weeping. But one of the things I love about it is that it's just tough love. She comes in here like just this blazing figure, and she says she sees these muses of poetry sitting by his bed, dictating to him. There's this image of passivity, that he's kind of indulging in these fantasies of emotion and feeling sorry for himself. And you think, well, to be fair, that maybe isn't completely out of line given what his situation is. But you'd think that maybe under the circumstances she might say, gosh, like you would in a situation, and you're dealing with a friend, someone who's I don't know, just been diagnosed with cancer or lost everything they ever owned or whatever. You might take a different tact. You might say, gosh, I'm really sorry about this. Or, what can I do? How can I support you? Or, you're right, this is horrific. You don't deserve this, man. But not Lady Philosophy. She comes in, both guns blazing, and essentially she says to him, first she says, who let these theatrical tarts, she calls them essentially whores, in? She says, they have no cures for your pain. They will only make it worse. And she kicks them out, and then she says, leave him to my muses to cure and make whole. And so you think, well, what is going on here? Because the statement she's making is that essentially these muses are bad news, but poetry is going to play a role in my therapy for this man. But I want to just come back to the tough love for a minute, because here she's like, she says, there's none of this soft, meet people where they are in a certain kind of immediate way. You're right. What you feel about yourself is all okay. No, the key to her therapy, and this is an absolutely fundamental Platonic concept. You see this in the entire idea of a Platonic line, in which you have modes of perception being matched with forms of reality, right? So the sense understands what sense understands, imagination or opinion, what opinion can understand. Then you get into reason, and then is it noesis in Plato? I've forgotten exactly which of the Greek words. But in any, you get these levels, and the point is that's going on there is that what you think you are seeing is determined by the mode of your apprehension. And this is an absolutely critical point when you're dealing with someone in, I don't know, depression or delusion or whatever, who thinks, the world has all gone to hell and I might as well just kill myself. This is, I'm not kidding with you. This is how I see the world. And at those moments, you have a choice to make. You can say, well, that's how you see the world, and that's fine. Or you can somehow find a way to get through to that person that how they see the world is at this moment limited, partial, and maybe very profoundly wrong. Now, that's exactly what Lady Philosophy does. Is she says to him, and this is, just imagine how harsh this is, given what Boethius has gone through. She says to him, you say that you're banished from your homeland. Well, I say to you, if you are banished, it is because you have banished yourself. Because your true homeland is one from which no one can ever take you. except if you will to be taken. So what you have going on here is a radical intervention that states straight out of the box, out of the gate, that his standpoint is profoundly wrong. But it's one thing to say that, and it's another thing, you can come to a person who's, sitting in their bed eating, donuts, streaming Netflix, and tell them that, maybe what they're seeing isn't, quite the wholeness of reality, but it may not, it may not get through. And this is where the Consolation is just an unbelievable work of genius, is for its pastoral power and beauty, its ability to find the prisoner where he is and to slowly move him from what he can see to what he can't see. And that happens partly early on, actually after this tough love moment, by very beautiful and gentle, what she calls her gentler medicines. She sings to him in stable rhythms of music that recur, that you might say convey to him the stability in a sensible, sensual form that he can't see intellectually. And so it's like patting a baby in a way on the back, bump, 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 bump. There's a lot of that in her poetry, of beautiful images, of images of an order, because his claim is essentially, the world is unjust. I was, not a perfect person, but I was good, I was moral, I was virtuous, and I have been outrageously punished for my good deeds. There is no order in the world. The fact is, that is all a sham. It doesn't exist. I know I made the arguments for it myself, but it is just an illusion. The actual fact is total disorder. And philosophy's technique is to say, well, first, to calm him with rhythms, but also to remind him with images that are of an order that he might be able to perceive, of the change of seasons, for example, these beautiful images of nature. And out of that, she's able to kind of coax him into saying, well, okay, I'm not saying there's no order. I know there's order in nature, and I know that, there's order in the astronomical, order of things. But where there is no order, he says, I'm telling you, is in the affairs of men. And from that point, she, the next several books, that's really the first book, the second and third book essentially involve philosophy taking him from different, through different, let's say, approaches to examine the things that he says he has lost unjustly. So his money, his position, his fame, his power, all of those things. And what she does above all first is she goes through and she says, none of these things were yours, actually. You think these jewels are yours? I take them away. Well, they're not yours now, are they? So what she's showing him is that he's falsely invested himself in external things that are not really his. She says anything that can be taken away isn't really yours. And then she does this wonderful judo move where she in the third book, where she looks at them again and she says, well, wait a second, what did you actually want in those things? And she shows that the things that were really sought in the money or the fame and so forth were spiritual goods like stability and self-sufficiency and inner power. And then she says, well, those are the things you were really after all. And then she says, well, in the middle of the third book, she goes through an argument that shows that those things are actually only one thing, and that is the good itself that you are seeking to have. And then she goes and she shows that in your seeking of those things, you're actually being moved by the good that you are seeking. And so she says, how things are not disordered after all, because all those affairs that you've described as disordered are actually ordered by a seeking of the good. And then essentially what happens is he comes to grasp this argument, but and I'm just going to go right through to the end here quickly, and then we can talk about the whole of different parts. But he says, well, and I should first say that there's a beautiful moment in the early books in which she essentially recites an argument that I think is in Plato's Gorgias, that this is, I think, so important. She says I think Plato's words are to commit is worse than to suffer wrong. So to do something bad is worse than to have something done bad to you. And this relies on this whole Platonic vision of virtue, in which, and you see this in Aristotle in the Ethics, which I think you've read, that virtue is an inner possession of a stable reality. It's actually in you. No one can take virtue away from you. They can torture you, as they did Boethius. They can take everything away from you, but virtue is your internal possession. And so this is a key part of this awakening of the self, this recollecting of the self, this meditation on what the self's really seeking in its activities, to see that what it seeks is an internal possession. And then Boethius, the prisoner, I should say, comes along and he's seeing these things, but then it hits him. He says, but wait, he says, if all these things are being ordered by the good, he said, how is there really any human freedom? Because if it's all ordered by the good, he says, that sounds good initially, but actually what that means is there's no freedom to what we do. Like, well, I'm right back to where I started, where actually this is, though I see now there's an order, it's totally not just. Why would we blame someone for doing something wrong if it's all predetermined and there's no free will? And so the last part of the Consolation is this really rich exploration of the question of the freedom of the will and of the integrity of the human personality. And you might say it's so important, not simply as an abstract philosophical question, I want to suggest to you, but because the whole movement of consolation that takes place in this book, this restoration of his faculties, this reweaving together of his whole soul, all of that would be undermined. You might say the freedom of the ascent would be just an illusion, and the entire movement would be undermined by this outcome. And so it's actually a matter of the absolute most vital character that it be the case, and he be able to understand it as the case, that this movement is actually a free one. And we could talk in detail about this ending, but essentially Boethius's answer to this is to show that all of these lower forms of knowing that he moves through are included in the highest form, just as your rationality, as you think about, I don't know, an orange or something, you're able to include in that your sense knowledge of that, your idea of the imaginative shape, and your knowledge of what an orange is in some abstract sense. All of these are included in the abstract sense. So too, she says, God's knowing is like that. It comprehends everything. But the counterpart to this is that in some sense, the activity of that higher unity is actually present in the lower forms of knowledge. And that is really the key to the Consolation. And I'll stop here with this, just to say that it comes around in the end, at least in my reading of this text, and if you have a different view, I would love to hear about it. But my reading, in essence, is that it comes around to saying not, as we were talking about the Greeks, the two worlds. The answer of Boethius is not, well, just find a ladder and get the heck out of here, ascend to the world of contemplation and let the madness of the world go off on its own. No, the man in the prison cell wants an answer that makes sense of where he is, that can somehow affirm the integrity of where he is as still having in that low, in the darkness and fragmentation of his life, to know that wisdom itself is with him. And I think fundamentally, that's what the Consolation is about and where it ends. So that the principle, you might say, the principle that one reflects on philosophically at the end is one that one actually already knows to have been present. And you know this yourself in a moment of consolation. If you've ever had in the moment of darkness a moment of light, if you've ever had any redemption of pain, if you've ever in fragmentation had any word of beauty or truth reach you, that must mean that the whole of things is in the part, that the unity is in the fragment. And I think that's what this book really not only is about philosophically, but brings about for those who read it.
Thank you so much for such a detailed exploration of the text and what it means to us. I'm sure I'm not the only person here who's slightly blown away by that. But I'd like to delve into a little bit more into the particulars with you, if I could, please. Because Boethius, he really wrestles with some fundamental questions which have troubled humans throughout the ages, such as, what is evil? Why does evil exist in the world? Does it play a purpose? And also, we touched on this a little bit when we talked about the reward of virtue and this sense in which wickedness is its own punishment. But there's also this question of, why do good things seem to happen why do bad things seem to happen to good people, and vice versa? Why do good things seem to happen to bad people? Boethius is, he's bewildered at the fact that he has tried to model his life on one of Plato's philosopher rulers. He thinks of himself as a just man. He's tried to be, broadly speaking, a good person, and yet it all seems to have blown up in his face. So I wonder if perhaps we could explore a bit more deeply what answers and what conclusions he draws during his dialogue with Lady Philosophy, and whether or not we find these convincing.
Well, thank you for that wonderful question. The first thing I would say in response to that is that I'm of course as sort of a Boethius man spent a lot of time with this wonderful work over quite a while now, 25 years or so. I will go down with the best of them, arguing about what a wonderful text this is and how persuasive its answers are, what intricate integrity and power the work has. But I would really just submit it in a pretty deep way to each of you to read, and if you haven't yet, but to hold it up to the light and see if you think it's persuasive. I think that's the mode in which it's meant to be taken in. I think that beyond that, I would say a few things. The first is that these are fundamental questions, as you said, I think very, very well. Like they're the questions you come to pretty quickly if you start thinking at all. I've often thought, the question about there's one of the ways of asking this is, why does God let bad things happen to good people? The old question of theodicy. And like, I'm not really sure how much of a difference putting God into that question makes. Like there's a profound sense in which, like, there's a real question there whether you believe in God or not. I see that from a certain contemporary understanding of what God is, it sharpens the question to put God in it as a kind of agent, let's say. But it's not clear to me that the atheist has solved many problems by taking God out of the question. You're still left, really, at the heart of it, wondering whether there's any order to life. That's really the core question here. Is there any order, like stable order to existence, to reality? Or is it an incoherent, an endlessly incoherent, or at least an ultimately incoherent thing? And I think those are good questions to wrestle with. Not least because today, there is a kind of dominant constructivist view that would say that there is no truth or beauty, no horizon, there are no eternal intelligibles. There is no fundamental knowable structure to reality. I think the ancients generally, and Boethius as an example, a wonderful sort of accessible example of those, takes us into the kind of thinking you need to think seriously about these questions. I do think his answers are persuasive, and I do think that they are ultimately, though they're kind of a reductio of a kind of a resume of many centuries of thought, I do think that they are a good both synthesis and way into that whole tradition of thinking, which I would suggest is very, very, very much more sophisticated, richer, deeper, and more adequate than the dominant intellectual standpoints of our present day. And by adequate, I mean able to give a meaningful, coherent account of our experience as we think about it. Maybe that's enough on that, but I have to say more.
Would you take a supplementary on that?
Happily.
Doctor? Excellent. We've got to the stage, it seems, where not only is it questionable whether there is a truth, goodness, and beauty, whether there is an order to the universe, to reality, but even whether there should be, whether order itself is a patriarchal, masculine construct derived from Greek philosophical differentiation of masculine reason versus feminine matter, and then at the Enlightenment, the denigration of the latter in favor of the former, this Apollonian sort of idea of Nietzsche, if you like, writ large, and then whether this Greek philosophical question has perverted the true liberative message of the gospel of the Old Testament, for example, in Christianity, or whether indeed Christianity and Judaism themselves are so bound up with this, with these definitions that they need to be scrapped altogether. Whether order, in fact, is a structure that that we should do away with altogether, because it is a gross infraction of our personal liberties and our rights to define ourselves. Should perhaps this entire canon be subjected to radical disordering and deconstruction?
That's a brilliantly put. I think you're right to say that that is not only a dominant viewpoint, but in a way that is the dominant viewpoint, gives us some sense of what is at stake in the question. I think there is a lot to be said here, and I would say two things fundamentally. The first is that gosh, there's so many things in here. I'll say a few things. The first is that I think it's important to try to, though I have a hard time doing so, I confess, think about whether there's any spiritual substance in the critique that can be taken up positively. I confess I find it hard to resist cynicism in response to this particular assault on any form of reasonable discourse or truth-seeking. I think the very terms of the critique depend on comparisons made through intellect. And so I think in that sense, it's deeply disingenuous and unselfconsciously so. But, insofar, as the Romantics were perhaps reacting against a certain sense of a narrow conception of the rational, and rightly, in a way, reacting against that, perhaps so too do we need to, I think, Benedict XVI's Regensburg Address, one of the most maligned works of literature in modern history, is really what it was about the need for the Hellenic in the Christian. And without getting into a long discourse on this, what he's saying is essentially that Christianity at its best is a Hellenic phenomenon for the reasons I think that are related to things I said at the first part of this conversation. And what he's suggesting is that in the modern, rationality has been diminished, and correspondingly what human beings can be has been diminished. And he would see that reopening up, remembering he gave this at the University of Regensburg, that reopening up has to do with the recapturing of the fullness of thinking itself as taking up all aspects of the real, not just a mechanized, instrumental, empirical science, but, the fullness of the movement of thought in our suffering and in beauty and in the whole nuanced unfolding of reality itself. So that's the first thing I think that needs to be said, is that we should, I would put my flag in that form of reason, not try and narrowly defend, let's say, a more closed down instrumental vision of it, which, does impoverish the human spirit. And so insofar as what's moving in that critique is, however patently incoherently, a sense that the human spirit needs better answers to these questions than we are currently offering, well, then I say, hell yes. Now, the second thing I would say is that this is one way in which I think the Greeks are just at the heart of what might be an antidote to this very kind of critique, precisely because they don't present the movement of the gods in a language that can be easily dismissed as denominational, as Christian or Catholic or Jewish or Muslim, but rather one can come to grips in, say, reading Homer with a certain sense of the intelligible character of reality and and the comprehensiveness of, you might say, the life of the gods and the relation between those eternal things and our own souls, our own lives, I think that the Greeks provide a way in to asking those questions, and in particular, they provide a way into asking about the very limits of rationality and about the, let's say, the relation that reason has to, or the limits of our knowing to the, let's say, wholeness or fullness of the real. I mean, the Greeks will be the first ones to both elevate our reason to, an astounding height, and then also give you the drama in which the people who see only that end up, committing incest with their mother and killing their fathers. So there's a wonderful way in which the Greeks, I think, allow us to ask these questions on very fundamental terms. And I would only say finally that, like, one does want to make the questioner honest and see to what extent, for example, such a person's own material circumstances, they would be willingly exchanged for, life in the middle of a war zone, of a trench, infested with, bacteria without antibiotics, with no means of speaking with anyone else, with no way of even interpreting day and night from each other, with no way of understanding even the smallest movements in nature, or even to be able to recognize. I mean, this needs to be said. If any of you have ever had the gift of being with a human being in the first weeks and months of its life, the baby does not know that this thing is part of it. And if you really want to go back to a state where there is no consciousness, there is no intelligible unification, I mean, you're really going to be stuck, very, very far from anything anyone would recognize as human life. Sorry, you got me going there.
On that note, I'm gonna. Wasn't unintentional.
I fell for it.
I was going to ask a question about. So, Boethius is a Christian, but in this moment of his suffering and with these questions of evil and the good, he doesn't bring up Christ explicitly. His explicit focus is on pagan and classical philosophy. So I guess the question is Christ in there? If so, where? And if not, why?
So that's these are all just wonderful questions, and that's a question that's been posed through the ages, and I'll say just a few things about it though. There was some doubt in some people's minds at certain points in history whether Boethius was in fact even a Christian. For this reason, it's now known, I think, pretty definitively that he was the author of these theological tractates, which are in, for those of you who have the Harvard Loeb edition, they're actually in here, and these are actually works like on the Trinity, for example. So they're explicitly Christian in their theological focus, and then that led some people even today to say, well, if that's the case, why is he not speaking about the Trinity and Jesus Christ and such in this book at the moment of his hardest moment? Does that mean that he lost his faith, or he rejected it, or he was, in the end, he was a rationalist rather than a fideist or something? I think there's a few things to say just quickly. The first is that I think this is an entirely coherent picture, and so I don't think there's any sense in which there's a contradiction here. Rather, I think what there is a challenge for Christians to think about what their faith means if it is put in terms that might be understood universally. So, there's the question of, well, let's take the question of Jesus, for example. Well, I'm definitely not saying there's nothing in the name, the word Jesus for Christians. But at the end of the day, you've got to think about what that word means, and what does the Bible even say it means. And I certainly don't think you can come to an account of that without at least putting a pretty serious focus, and this certainly in the history of Christian theology, what actually happens on those first words of the Gospel of John that talk about the Word through whom all things were made, and by which was not anything made that was made. So the suggestion is that all things are made in and through the Word, and that somehow, not somehow, but that is what makes them coherent. So that the knowability, the coherence of things is itself Christ, or the Logos, as an active principle. So I think a few things to be said. First, that I think this figure of sapientia or philosophia in this figure of philosophy of wisdom, this is very much a sort of sapiential figure. This is a figure of the Word, I would say, understood in its philosophical as not only the whole history of wisdom, but of wisdom itself in the soul as a mediating principle of reality, in that sense of as what Christians would describe as Christ's mediating work, understood universally. And next thing I would say is that it's very different to be Boethius than to be Augustine. I mean, Augustine is still in maybe it's not quite fair to say polemical relationship, but it really needs to sort of say, Christianity is this, it is not that. But 100 years later, when really Christianity has already achieved a kind of status of universality, at least largely speaking in the world, it's a very different question. The move from Boethius is not to say, oh no, this is Christian and not pagan. It's rather to say, we're not going to be able to understand our Christianity if we don't have the resources of this long history to help us do that. And so finally, I would say that I see this as a kind of Christian book in a universal frame. And yet, I think it also needs to be said that the widely repeated idea that there are no references to the Bible in here is also very demonstrably false. There's not only a reference to a pretty clear reference to the work in the suaviter fortiterque phrase that God moves all things, governs them strongly and sweetly, from the Book of Wisdom, but also it's been shown by the genius and spiritual giant that Father Harris and I had the great gift of spending some time with, the late Robert Krauss. It's been shown by him that if you look, if you listen to even the first 5 pages of the Consolation with an ear trained in the Latin Bible, and in particular in the Latin of the wisdom books, there are not just 1 or 2, but dozens and dozens of parallels between the description of sapientia in the book of Sapientia and the description of philosophy in the Consolation of Philosophy. So it is as though, while he's brilliantly put this in a universal frame, he's also given these wonderful echoes to the frame of revelation for those who have ears to hear them, but without recognizing those somehow the condition of understanding what this is. I could happy to say more about that, but I don't want to go further without maybe another kind of question on that draws out these really wonderful questions further.
Well, I think that's much appreciated. I think I'm just going to quickly scan the crowd here to see if anybody has a hand up. Yes, I see that Maddie Harris does, so I'll just ask her to come forward with her question.
Hiya. I was just wondering why philosophy is represented as a woman, and then also kind of on that, why wisdom generally is personified in like the female form.
Gosh, do you know what? That is an absolutely wonderful question for which I do not have a good, let alone scholarly answer. I certainly think that it may have something to do with some earlier figures in the history of literature and scripture. I mean, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that the scripture itself refers to wisdom in the feminine. So there's that. You also have, we were talking about the Odyssey earlier. We have Athena as the goddess of wisdom. I had the great pleasure of being in Greece last year, and you just have these many wonderful images associated in the temple with Athena and of other women and wisdom figures. It's a very, very wonderful question, and I think frankly it both challenges and illuminates our maybe somewhat closed or fixed ideas that we might be tempted to have about the history, the earlier history. I'd say a couple of other things. I think there is pretty clearly a sense of the, certainly in lady philosophy. I mean, she's never, I don't think, called lady philosophy. That's kind of an English thing that people use. She's simply called philosophy here, but she's clearly, very clearly gendered in the sense she is a woman. It's not sort of sexless or accidentally translated. So I think you're really picking up on something very crucial here. The imagery is not mistakable as, well, maybe it was a man and it was just sort of the tradition. No, it's clearly a woman. There's a wonderful phrase in the early part of the text I think, just to focus on the Consolation, I do want to gesture towards that. There's this long history that I think no doubt many have written about, but which I know cannot say a lot about why wisdom in earlier traditions and even about the iconography of the symbols as feminine. I just haven't thought about it enough, so I'm not going to try and say much about it. But I do want to say, in the Consolation, there's a line in the early book where philosophy is, as I say, upbraiding him with this tough love, saying, you can only banish yourself. And she said, and she at one point says, it would be bad enough if an unlettered man, an uneducated man, were in this state that you're in. But she says, for goodness sakes, are you not the same one who, and she says, I think she says, who was nourished on my milk and, raised, and she says, like essentially in my home. I've forgotten exactly the language, I could find it here. But there's this very maternal imagery to that scene. And it's also the case that though she is this extremely fierce character whose head reaches the very heavens and sometimes is even lost to beyond the heavens, so she is a figure of eternal wisdom and power without any question. She also sometimes has the height of a normal man, he says, and what is going on there, I think, is this incarnate principle, God incarnate. And so there's this beautiful moment at the very beginning, you may remember, where he's crying and he can't even recognize this figure. He can't see her. He actually can't see her. His vision is blurred with tears. And it says that she makes a fold in her dress, which is another really rich symbol, which we won't get into, and wipes away the tears from his eyes. It's a beautiful scene. And so I'm just suggesting that on the one hand, there are very deep and wonderful things that you've encouraged me to think about further, about the whole history of the symbolic portrayals of wisdom as feminine. But on the other hand, as a first thought about this, I would say in the Consolation, there is very clearly a sense in which philosophy's work is of bringing out, as it were, giving to birth of his, and recollecting, in the language of Plato, his true self. And that is, without any question, a work that has to take up the particularity of his being, of his body, and match it with the universality of the eternal life of God. And so I think my answer to your question is that that the nurturing, all-powerful act of coming to wisdom is very richly portrayed and understood, at least on a certain frame, as feminine.
With that, Dr. Blackwood, I think I'm going to bring everything to a close. I'm aware that some of the people with us are preparing to head off to Compline shortly. And I can say that if anybody else here feels like I do, we have an immense amount to think on. And to you, I think we all owe a huge debt of thanks. And not only are we grateful to have you here with us tonight, but I think